Welcome to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Jamie Doucette and Seung-Ook Lee. Jamie is a lecturer at the University of Manchester, and Seung-Ook is an assistant professor at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology, and they both focus their research around geography and East Asia. Importantly for this podcast, this comes with a focus on the Kaesong Industrial Complex and other special economic zones inside North Korea. Jamie and Seung-Ook have both done a considerable amount of joint research on this topic, and so today we're going to do a joint discussion. And they both come to Kaesong from slightly different directions, and yet both come out of this seeing Kaesong in similar ways. That is, as a form of experimental territoriality. One that, by its unique location and the political factors involved, is uniquely volatile, and yet one that is also required to do a lot more than the average hopes on economic progress and development. Now, the Kaesong Industrial Complex is a sunshine-era policy, an idea hatched under the Kim Dae-jung presidency, and something that would begin a step towards reunification. Kaesong, once up and operational, would bring about communication between the two Koreas. It would bring technological exchanges, social interactions. It would become a springboard for other policies, such as family reunion, knowledge exchanges, and cultural events. And underneath it all would be a raw capitalism. South Korean firms would get access to cheap North Korean labor, and North Korean workers would get relatively high pay and employment. The heavy financial burden of setting Kaesong up was borne mostly by Hyundai Asan, a single large chaebol inside South Korea. But Kaesong became a manufacturing hub for hundreds of small to medium-sized South Korean companies that saw the advantage in this special economic zone. They would provide the infrastructure, the financing, the technology, and the managers, and the North Koreans provided over 50,000 wage laborers. There were huge concerns inside South Korea about this, specifically from the conservative side of politics. They saw this interaction with North Korea as a form of Trojan horse, and also a unique liability. South Korea in many ways were exposing themselves to North Korean whims. At any time, the regime in Pyongyang could close down Kaesong, and with it they would seize all the infrastructure, all the development, all the technology, and then they would also have the ability to hold hostage those South Koreans isolated inside Kaesong, inside North Korea. And this happened twice. But the remarkable thing about Kaesong is just how resilient it was. It survived the shooting of a South Korean tourist in Mount Kumgang. It survived the shelling of Yeonpyeon Island, the sinking of the SS Cheonan, and countless missile provocations. And it did so through multiple governments from both sides of politics. There were always concerns about the human rights of the North Korean workers. The idea that this is a form of slave labor, or that by using North Korean labor, South Korea were in violation of international sanctions. But regardless, Kaesong survived until Park Geun-hye eventually closed it down in 2016 under the concerns and the accusation that the profits being made in Kaesong were being directed directly towards the military, specifically the missile and nuclear programs. And this all brings us towards the current moment and the current diplomatic outreach that has been happening. There has been a huge push, not just from South Korea, but also internationally for the reopening of Kaesong. It is once again seen as a means for the two Koreas to interact, for trust to be built, for wealth to be produced, and for Kaesong to be used as a stepping stone towards broader reunification, or at least low-level confederation. But the future of Kaesong, of course, remains in doubt. Reopening it for South Korea would mean reopening all those liabilities of the past, and again allowing North Korea to hold another avenue of leverage over them. And for the North Koreans, this brings concerns of its own. Fears of the impact of what Kaesong might do to the workers, do to the minds of the population, and even as shown through this podcast, there is concern of the military liability based on the strategic location of this special economic zone. But from here, I will let Jamie and Seung-Ook explain this in much greater detail. Now, I should offer an explanation from the start. This is a three-person discussion done via the internet. So there is a degree in which we will occasionally speak over each other, and occasionally there will be moments of silence when we are all waiting for each other to talk. These don't have any impact really on the podcast whatsoever, but it is just one of those hazards and one of those unavoidable facts of speaking to three people this way. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener, and if you do want it to continue, please consider donating at the Patreon account or the PayPal link attached below. All the help, no matter how small, is greatly appreciated. On that, and to talk us through the issues of territoriality concerning the Kaesong Industrial Complex and other special economic zones inside North Korea, this is Jamie Doucette and Seung-Ook Lee. Jamie Doucette and Seung-Ook Lee, thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thanks for having us here.
Great. So we're going to be talking through some joint research that you both have been doing around the Kaesong Industrial Complex and the broader issue of extra-territoriality. So just as a very opening question and a lead-in for people that may be unfamiliar, what is the Kaesong Industrial Complex? Just as a very broad issue, I might direct this to Seung-Ook just to kick us off.
Okay, Kaesong Industrial Complex is one of the major industrial complex conducted by both South and North Korea from the early 2000 and until 2016, and it was now closed down. But actually, it was designed to combine the North Korean the land, labor power with the South Korean capital technology. So it's kind of really new model for the inter-Korean economic development project to boost not just the economic cooperation, but also kind of testing some kind of unification model in the Korean Peninsula. But in our paper, we kind of try to focus on it's not just smooth operation. There's many kind of complexity and dynamics around the operation of the Kaesong Industrial Complex. So we try to shed more light onto this, more experimental or volatile, the quality of this, the project.
And Jamie, take us into some of the theory behind this. Why would a country ever do this sort of thing? So just for people listening, Kaesong is just above the DMZ, just inside North Korea. So why would South Korea or North Korea or any country undertake such an idea, at least in theory?
I guess, it always helps to have some kind of working relationship, even in situations where there's a lot of antagonism that shapes the peninsula. I think also something else you said about extra-territoriality. On the conceptual level, both of us are geographers. And one of the things that political geographers are interested in is the modern state, its territory, its borders. And one of the longstanding insights in this literature is that, the borders of a nation and its sovereignty and its territoriality are not always contiguous. It's kind of an ideal type, if you will, this idea that the state is this kind of coherent authority over a firmly delimited piece of land that is contiguous with where borders and territory are contiguous. So, throughout history, you might think of a lot of different types of spaces where territoriality, sovereignty are kind of shared. You might think about embassies, shared kind of border zones, countries that don't respect the territoriality of other countries. And so it's kind of an interesting political geographical construct, if you will. So we're kind of interested, it's a kind of interesting site of kind of shared sovereignty and territoriality. So that was a kind of motivation also behind studying it, not only for the kind of political function that it can play in terms of generating peace or economic engagement, everyday working relations between North and South Koreans, but also is a very interesting type of territoriality on its own, one that, as Seung-Ook already mentioned, is potentially rather kind of unstable and complicated.
And to set something like this up, just as a broad idea, so this is a joint industrial complex inside North Korea, run by South Koreans and manned largely by North Koreans. So what are the laws are available here? Because you have to assume they're not going to function in terms of South Korean law, not going to function in terms of North Korean law. So how does this begin?
How does it begin? Or the legal process?
Yeah, this legal process. Yeah, are they hinging on either country's legal system, or is there a brand new compromise down the middle for this?
Someone can maybe talk about the origins of it, but I would say that also it depends what aspects of that territoriality or territory that you're thinking of. So, as we say in the article, certain goods made in Kaesong in North Korea can be classified as made in South Korea. So therefore, they're kind of falling into like South Korean product law. But then other aspects of it become a part of North Korean law. And of course, there are special laws that govern the zone as such. Maybe Seung-Ook can follow on here.
Yeah, that's right. So actually, there are kind of dual track in terms of the Kaesong Industrial Complex, the legal system. The one is that North Korea, the government, it actually the set up its own the legal procedure for this Kaesong Industrial Complex. It's kind of some special act about the Kaesong Industrial Complex, but also the both South Korean government and North Korean government definitely negotiate, and then they determine the how to run this the new type of the industrial complex between two sides. So definitely there's two different the legal mechanisms working in terms of the Kaesong Industrial Complex.
And in terms of the function on the ground here, this is, I assume, a large complex of factories. And just run us through the management and the labor structures involved here. How many people are we talking about? How large a space? And who is doing what work? Who is supplying what money? Who is supplying what expertise?
At its peak, sorry, Seung-Ook, please.
No, you should start. I can add something more. Yeah.
I guess at its peak it was about 75,000 workers. Is that correct, Seung-Ook? Or only...
it's kind of almost 55,000 workers from the North Korean side and around the 800 from the South Korean side. So its total is around the 60,000 people from the both Koreas, I think.
And the basic manufacturing, what are they making here? Is it highly complex stuff, or is it the sort of low-level manufacturing and the sort of low technological based manufacturing stuff?
Well, because due to there's a still even at the time, this complex was under operation. There's a sanction from the U.S. and our international society. So both Korea could not initiate any kind of some high tech or some other more advanced, industries in Kaesong Industrial Complex. More focus on some labor intensive, the manufacturing stuff in the Kaesong Industrial Complex. Well, definitely North Korean side want to enhance the industrial structure in the Kaesong Industrial Complex, but due to this kind of the economic sanction issue, it was difficult to upgrade their industrial structure in the Kaesong Industrial Complex.
So, for instance, when I went there about 12 years ago now, we visited one of the hiking apparel factory that was making hiking shoes. And so the managers there were complaining that they couldn't use the laser cutters, so they had to cut all the molds, I guess, for making the hiking boot by hand. So that's kind of ends up being a bit more labor intensive than it would in South Korea, where you could just have a laser cutter to cut through this fabric.
And I think you touched on it just a second there, as I think it was you, Jamie, as you were explaining your question just before. There's an idea here, and it is an interesting one, that when you have these spaces and these economic zones that exist outside your country, they become a little bit more than just furthering your own national economic structure and getting access to new labor. There can also be what you've both written about in this article as zones for testing new ideas and testing new ground here. So there's some way in which you can experiment in different directions that you wouldn't be able to ordinarily underneath your own I suppose political and economic restrictions.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And this brings up a theme in kind of East Asian urbanization in general. And that's kind of the importance of these sort of special economic zones in this kind of, I guess, urban history of the last 40 years. I think there's something like almost 55 million workers in East Asia who work in different special economic zones. Some of them are very tightly connected to certain industrial policy directives, like only certain sorts of firms can locate there. Some of them are a bit more freewheeling. And so in some ways, our article kind of contributes to that literature about the kind of role of this kind of spatial form, because it's not a city, it's not a province. It often has varying degrees of legal exception or special regulation, but it's an important form for understanding, I guess, East Asian developmentalism, East Asian development, and even contemporary strategies. If you think about current zones in South Korea, for instance, like Songdo, and special cities like Songdo, Busan Jinhae Free Economic Zone, and so on.
And if we move up, I might move this question across to you, Seung-Ook. This is not the first time for people listening. Some people may be unaware of the region as a whole. This is certainly not the first time that North Korea has engaged in such behavior. They have different similar, I suppose, joint economic activities inside their own country, but also this is a country that has often committed its own people beyond its own borders towards, I suppose, not so much economic zones, but a form of sending your labor abroad to bring money back home. So it has a similarity of sorts.
Well, that's right. Definitely there are two different, the mechanisms working in the North Korean, the economic relationship with the outside world. The first we focus on, so-called the zones is that, starting from the 1991, the first special economic zone in the Rason area in the northeastern side of the North Korean territory, and it spread to the Kaesong Industrial Complex and other parts of the territory. But also recently, I think, many of you know that, this kind of, the zone is not working well, even though the North Korea is, expanding these different zones. I think they are currently have some 27 different, the zones, including some large size of the special economic zones, the kind of small size so-called development zones. But, even though they are eagerly expanding this, the kind of the limited form of the economic opening, it does not, effectively work. So that's the reason, not just to China and Russia, the North Korean government is sending, their laborers, to the neighboring countries. And as you know, the international sanctions by the U.S. and the UN, they have forbade, this kind of using this labor power of the North Korea. So, they are not renewing, the visa for the North Korean laborers. So that's already one of the agendas between, the recent summit meeting between the Putin from the Russian government and Kim Jong-un is definitely about this kind of the labor issue, I think.
And I suppose you touched on it there, this idea of a labor issue. So before we get into the real meat of your research here, there's a couple of questions about partly theory, partly in practice, what each side is getting out of this. So these are two countries, and as you explained just before, Jamie, there is I suppose, a very fraught challenge here, and a lot of issues come forward, and it is a risky issue, and we will get to all that. But on theory, what are South Korea getting out of this, and what are North Korea getting out of this, beyond in terms of economics itself? So beyond the idea of just building a deeper cooperation, deeper friendship, the economics of it, what is either side gaining from this?
I mean, it depends on the different actors. So on the one hand, as you point out, politically, there's a certain dividend to inter-Korean engagement. I think for light manufacturing industries in South Korea, there's also this potential, what we call in geography, a spatial fix, a kind of space they can control and make profit from in terms of cheaper labor costs. I think often these were firms that maybe didn't internationalize during the 90s and 2000s. Maybe they didn't have the capital. But this provided them an avenue. Seung-Ook can confirm that. From North Korea's side, I mean, there's also that chance to, experiment with new labor processes. There's a really interesting question about what that actually looks like on the ground. Like how do we understand North Korean labor in these zones, considering the nature of the North Korean economy, which isn't necessarily based on wage labor in the same way that the South Korean economy is. So how do you even think about payments and governance in that kind of context is an interesting conceptual question. So there's these themes like rehearsing, integration, trying out new forms of production and technology in the loose sense of like ways of organizing production, new materials and such. New site of investment for South Korea, like keeping them kind of active in potential future engagement and unification, integration.
So let's turn that over to you, Seung-Ook. Okay, let's build in that question a little bit. So, if someone was going to be cynical about this, this is a lot of people from the conservative right of South Korean politics, at least a few years ago, used to say this is just a way for large companies, large chaebol inside South Korea to take advantage of cheap labor and in some ways slave labor, and not have to worry about not just adequate payment but also adequate human rights.
Well, actually, that is not fact because, it's not the chaebols, the big companies invest in this, the joint industrial complex. It is mostly, the small and medium companies. The problem is that there are different interpretations about this Kaesong Industrial Complex helps benefit some small and medium companies or not. Like the ruling party in current government, there's kind of it's called the Minju Party members. They stress that this Kaesong Industrial Complex, we need to revive this Kaesong Industrial Complex to help, the small and medium companies to need some cheap labor power. However, the opposition party, called in Korean the 자유한국당, I think Free Korea Party, something like that. So they still stress that, well, the government just focus on rely on the Kaesong Industrial Complex, neglecting, the needs from the small and medium companies in South Korea. So they are both sides actually politicized in this Kaesong Industrial Complex, definitely.
And you both, sorry, Jamie, kind of.
The question of labor is an interesting one, and when I was doing my original research, I was more interested in that issue, given the kind of low pay of workers there. But it's a tricky issue to talk about because on the one hand, I can agree that it's not the best imagining of engagement to have basically a kind of runaway, small, mid-sized factory zone with low wages. There's other forms of economic integration and horizontal cooperation that may be more egalitarian and not based on the kind of sweatshop model potentially. At the same time, we want to also avoid this kind of fantasy of hyper exploitation per se. I mean, it's difficult to verify the kind of everyday lives of these workers because it's impossible to do that kind of research. But from what I know, these are also relatively privileged workers from Kaesong and Pyongyang. I don't think. I don't know. It's an interesting question about how you assess exploitation in this kind of case. From what I know from interviews is that the workers are, not at the bottom of this North Korean social structure, but it's difficult to analyze. Seung-Ook might have some more thoughts on that issue.
Well, definitely, as Jamie mentioned, I think this so-called the labor exploitation becomes the major discourse towards the not just South Korean conservative the people, but also the U.S. side, because they stress they are linked this the labor exploitation in the Kaesong Industrial Complex with the North Korean human rights issue. So they try to stress that this is another side for the the human rights issue in North Korea. But definitely the South Korean government reject those arguments. And as Jamie mentioned, actually in North Korea, there's kind of some kind of desire, the North Korean people, we want to work in this, the Kaesong Industrial Complex. They have much higher wage than the average North Korean people. And also they enjoy other privilege, from kind of, from this bonus and other things in the Kaesong Industrial Complex. So even some scholars argue that the Kaesong Industrial Complex is forming, the new class in North Korea. So that's the reason, someone expect, the North Korea's reform and opening up like the China, argue that we need to continue this project, because this can change the North Korea into more Chinese type of the reform and opening. But definitely others reject those possibilities, I think.
And you have both touched on it slightly so far, so I might just bring this in here. If this, as I think it was Jamie and I think Seung-Ook, you touched on it as well, this idea that despite these goods being manufactured inside North Korea, they are technically considered South Korean products. So how has South Korea managed to, if they have, incorporate this into their exports? Because as I think you both mentioned already, there's been an issue of sanctions on North Korea for a while. And this would seem, at least in principle, to be a violation of at least some international sanctions, perhaps only international sanctions relating to some countries, or some countries would perhaps have ethical concerns, import and direct from North Korea. So is there any limitation on what South Korea can do with these goods, or used to be able to do with these goods once they had them?
Well, I'm not exactly sure how many were actually exported, but I mean, there's different periods of sanctions, right? And so this project begins in the mid 2000s. I forget exactly where the sanctions regime was up then, but it probably wasn't as tight as it has been since 2012. So right, about a year and a half after the zone opened, there certainly was this continuing push to include those goods in South Korea's free trade agreements with China, with ASEAN, and even the Korea-U.S. free trade agreement, Chorus FTA, that was being negotiated in 2006. And Nomihyun government really pushed to get these goods recognized. And I think, the Americans wouldn't, but they sort of did pay a lip service to acknowledging South Korea's desire to include this. So if I don't know if it had a sort of functional purpose in terms of creating a lot of exports, but it had an important symbolic purpose, I think, to sort of have these included in those agreements.
And let's jump into building this narrative up a little bit here. So I might get you to begin here, Seung-Ook, and build us up through the Sunshine Era, the idea of a newly democratized South Korea, and the first thing on people's lips after they become free and open is to pursue this idea with more vigor of reunification. So take us to the Kim Dae-jung era, the idea of the Sunshine Policy, and how Kaesong became not just an economic platform, but something that was a platform towards broader unification.
Okay, so I think many of you may know about this. The Kim Dae-jung government initiated some new approach to the inter-Korean relationship. So named the Sunshine Policy. It is that through the economic cooperation engagement with the North Korea, it is called in our paper the Geonghyop. So the economic cooperation with the North Korea, we can definitely change the North Korean system, bring them out of some isolated situation to more engagement with not just South Korea, with the outside world. That's the design of the Kim Dae-jung government. So that's the reason they envision the Kaesong Industrial Complex and also the Geumgang Mountain Complex as the major experiment to test, not just economic cooperation between two Koreas, but also testing, the kind of possibility of the, getting together, two Koreas living together, working together. So that's the reason many, view this new experiment as it's the very important step towards the reunification. So we can actually practicing the unification through this site. So that's definitely the expectation from the liberal side or progressive side of the South Korean, the politics, not the conservative groups actually.
And there's been a number of times throughout your research here, both of you, that you brought up this idea. And so if we leave on one side that concept of reunification and this being not just an economic project, but a project towards peace and reunification, there's also been an idea that you've both brought up, the idea, and I suppose it's not new in a way, but the idea of a capitalist peace, as in if countries begin to trade and they open up trade routes and they become more interconnected, then it is less likely that they are going to push towards war and conflict. But this is North Korea. And North Korea are at least by their own designation, a military-first country. And this is a capitalist outreach. So I might get you to touch on that sort of dichotomy here and some of the challenges involved in that process and how realistic you think it is that capitalism, in a sense, can lead to broader peace or broader opening up.
I guess someone could probably talk about the balances between military first and other interests. I mean, we're not necessarily endorsing it as a capitalist piece, but I think people see it that way, right? If you have people trading and such. But I don't want to say that this is some universal law that capitalism brings peace, because certainly it brings war and turbulence as well. But maybe, even on the South Korean liberal left, there's a feeling that at least it was confined to that. That doesn't mean that there isn't desire, though, for a more even stronger type horizontal relations, right? In some ways, it limits the imagination of peace and reunification to kind of confine the engagement to just this kind of factory zone. I think there's people who would rather see much more horizontal engagement.
Well,
the structure of the North Korean economy is also an interesting issue too, but I'll let someone deal with that.
Well, I agree with you, Jamie, that, we do not fantasize the possibility of this kind of, the tasks actually bring about some new geopolitical appeasement between two Koreas, or maybe the lessening the opposition in the Korean Peninsula. Well, and also we problematize, this kind of experiment that leads to another form of the capitalist, the exploitation, like the Jamie also elaborate in the paper. So, I think many liberal politicians and media stress and highlight, this kind of inter-Korean economic exchange definitely bring about the unification, and we can teach the North Korea about the capitalism. We can teach about the profit making and those things, so we can change North Korea. But well, I think there's definitely the danger side in that kind of the approach towards North Korea, because we just naturalize the capitalist order and capitalist the system is definitely bring about this kind of the peace and stability. But well, I think we cannot just naturalize that.
And if that is one side of the political argument here, if that is Kim Dae-jung's side, this idea of the sunshine policy, I might get you, and you can both weigh in here because I know you've both done a lot of research into South Korean politics itself. I might introduce this moment now in 2008 where a South Korean tourist is shot in the other site that you mentioned there, Seung-Ook, the Mount Kumgang project, which is this tourist resort in North Korea, similar idea to the Kaesong Industrial Complex, but South Korean tourists go there. A tourist is shot, and Lee Moon-bak, the conservative president at the time, shuts down the project, and with it goes the family reunifications at the same time. And there's an idea that's been brushed around in politics at this time that these sort of projects not so much beneficial, but with them also comes a huge risk to South Korea's territorial integrity.
Well, yeah, that's right. So especially the conservative side point out the so-called the risk from this kind of test, and they stress that this Kaesong Industrial Complex and the Kumgang Mountain project, there's kind of some not just the tragedy like the one tourist in the shot death by the North Korean soldiers, but also there's some also minor issues in the Kaesong Industrial Complex, like the car accident death, something like that. So, but more essentially, I think, the problems, the especially the conservative side point out is that this kind of, the special economic zone project rather worsen the security of the South Korea. For example, the Park Geun-hye government, the previous government, when the government shut down the Kaesong Industrial Complex in 2016, I think almost 3 years ago, the key explanation is that this site, this industrial complex, they actually support the development of the nuclear and missiles. So that's the reason we shut down this complex. Even though there's no firm evidence, the money from the Kaesong Industrial Complex is used to fund the missiles and the nuclear power. But that's the major explanation by the conservative side towards this kind of inter-Korean economic project. And even today, I think there's still kind of some rumors in South Korea that the Moon Jae-in government continuously, the giveaway. In Korean terms, it's called the 퍼주기. The giveaway towards the North Korea, we're giving the rice, so that's the reason it leads to the price, the rise of the rice, something like that. So there's kind of false rumors, kind of the spreading towards the South Korean public that this kind of some economic interaction, economic cooperation with the North Korea actually simply benefit the North Korea, and eventually definitely the risk the worsen the security risk in the Korean Peninsula in South Korea.
And I might get a way in there, Jamie, on this, but I might get you also add in another dimension that happened during this time. And despite Lee Moon-bak and despite the Conservatives being in power, didn't seem to affect the run-in of Kaesong too much. And that was the sinking in 2010 of the SS Cheonan and the bombing of an island off the South Korean coast. And it seems almost inconceivable today to look back and think that this didn't really affect, at least as I can read it, didn't seem to affect the run-in of Kaesong. So I suppose might take us to what just happened there, but what was the ramifications of this event, and did it in any way affect what happened on the ground in Kaesong?
Well, if I answer it, it's kind of great, the irony, because even in the western coast, there's some, two sides, the exchange, some, the firing and shooting, but there's still the interchange and interaction in the trans-border interaction in the Kaesong Industrial Complex. So that's kind of really the ironical situation, I think. And many the South Korean scholars also point out that. But thing is here, due to this kind of the Kaesong Industrial Complex, this most the kind of tension or military conflict did not escalate into the further tension and further conflict further in between two Koreas. I think so. That's the reason. Definitely the Kaesong Industrial Complex served in a certain way in terms of the geopolitical the tension reducing or those purpose, I think.
I think it's also eventually affected.
Sorry, Jamie, go.
I think it was also eventually affected by some of the new sanctions that came in after that, and there's certainly other periods where it was shut down or transit, entry and exit into the zone stopped because of some of these tensions. But it's true that it was ironic that even during Lee Myung-bak, regarded as kind of a Cold War anti-communist, that this project continued relatively smoothly, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And that was one of the fears that you've both written about here, that and one of the liabilities I think you touched on earlier, Jamie, the idea that in most of these sort of instances around the world of special economic zones, you don't have to deal with the sort of volatility that you have to deal with in the North Korean case, the sort of hang-ups from the old Cold War and the politics that run through this. So I might get you to open up the I suppose in some ways the unique risks involved in this sort of project itself, beyond the economics and beyond the hope of peace from it.
Well, I guess there's just that multi-scalar layering between the local up to the global, because it's such all these different elements: geopolitics, trade, domestic political configurations on either side of the border and within the wider Northeast Asian region, down to local actors and older territorial disputes like the Northern Limit Line and so on. All those things kind of converge and get compressed, and so it adds to that volatile mix. Of course, some other zones and other places may have some similar volatility, but this one is quite interesting in that kind of very charged multi-scalar layering. So that's very conceptual, but that was something also that kind of interested us, to the point even that the imagination of the zone by other actors becomes kind of interesting and a source of tension. We write a little bit about those kind of perks that North Korean workers get for working there in the form of the choco pie, this popular
yes.
South Korean snack cake. And so the workers were often rewarded with this kind of cake in kind, and I think something like over 1 million boxes of these were distributed. But then that became this kind of image in South Korea of kind of a Trojan horse introduction of capitalism through the symbol of the corporate the choco pie, and North Korea itself became sensitive about this. So it's quite interesting the way in which the zone, little aspects of the zone, kind of leak out and became part of a kind of popular culture and even a kind of geopolitically infused tension regarding these understandings.
Well, let's pause there for a second. Let's talk more about the choco pie, because it seems like a sort of a funny side note. But as you mentioned, it becomes a very charged political discussion, both inside South Korea, but even inside North Korea. So I might get both of you to introduce here and tell me what was the significance of this choco pie? Why were these being given out to North Korean workers at all? And in some ways, it began to touch on a problem that I think Jamie, you touched on earlier, the idea of the North Korean economy. That is, these choco pies started to find themselves onto the North Korean market, and they would be selling in the black market for quite high prices.
Mm-hmm.
What we really need is, what I kind of mourn, is that we don't have any amazing anthropologists who can really kind of study how these things kind of operate. Whether or not it's a status good or something that's more pragmatically exchanged in the jangmadang for money. I think maybe, and I might be a bit speculative here, is that the workers are paid, were paid $60 US, $70 US a month, but of course that currency doesn't directly go to them. They're paid some kind of cash equivalent in North Korean won, and so this thing is kind of a perk. some might even say payment in kind. A few years ago, I was talking to someone from Hyundai Asan who was part of the joint management. Was he Hyundai Asan? I forget exactly. He was part of the management of the zone, and I used the word payment in kind. He's like, no, this is not payment in kind. It's just a gift. Because they don't. South Korea doesn't also want to be seen as paying workers in chocolate pies. So, but as to actually the everyday life of like what the North Korean workers do with the chocolate pie and how that supplements their own kind of economic strategies, I really don't know. So maybe Seung-Ook has more information.
So as I pass this back to you, Seung-Ook, I might just introduce the chocolate pie is a small chocolate treat that is sold, I think, only in South Korea. I haven't seen it in any other country.
Oh, and they sell it here. They sell it I've seen it in England. So
all right. So I'm wrong about that. So yeah. So go out and find it, everyone listening. It's a small treat, but it is very popular here in South Korea. And it began to get passed around, as you said, as a I suppose a gift to the North Korean workers. And as you rightly have points here, it almost became part of policy. That is, anyone working a night shift also gets a choco pie, so to speak. And it really begins to take on a much larger significance. So Seung-Ook, I might get you to come in here.
Yeah. Well, actually, I read some of the interviews with the South Korean managers who work in the Kaesong Industrial Complex, and they interview that the North Korean workers, view this choco pie as kind of the mirror to the South Korean society. So they can definitely understand and appreciate the South Korean development through this kind of choco pie. That's the reason. Well, there's a term they use kind of chocofiization. So that we're actually meaning the North Korea's reform and opening up. So that's the reason the choco pie that becomes the major, the medium to lead the North Korea into the reform and opening up. Well, change the people's, the mindset, and so that's the reason. Well, even though as I told you, the conservative politicians and the media, they definitely criticize, this Kaesong Industrial Complex is a dangerous project. It definitely just helped the North Korea regime, but they acknowledge this, this chocofiization will have some possibility to change the North Korean side. So, but thing is here, North Korea definitely understand the side effect from this kind of choco pie. So they ask, to replace this choco pie with the product produced in North Korea. So that's the reason they stopped, the giving the choco pie as a gift. And I heard that. So that's the reason there are so many choco pies just left in South Korea, because that is not actually the sold in South Korea. There's a difference between the choco pie for the North Korea, the Kaesong Industrial Complex, and the choco pie for the South Korean market. So that's the reason I heard that this, the number of the choco pie for the Kaesong Industrial Complex is all, the consumed in the South Korean military, the soldiers.
Yeah. So on this topic of labor, there's also another interesting aspect of this that you both mentioned in your research here. The idea that most of the workers, and I think both of you touched on before, that a lot of people were quite wealthy. They're from the Kaesong region and from the Pyongyang region. But they're also mostly women. So I might get you to touch on that. Why were most of the workers in Kaesong women, and what was the policy behind this, and what were some of the challenges involved in this, some of the fears that people from South Korea had about this?
I mean, on the surface, it does bear resemblance to a lot of, feminized light manufacturing, special economic zones in other parts of the world. There's often a lot of, harsh gender stereotyping, sexist assumptions about those workers being docile or easy to discipline. When I did the tour of the zone, a lot of the managers would say this kind of similar thing. Oh, the workers are really disciplined and dexterous, even kind of comparing different nations, that also kind of raised fears about the kind of, sweated labor you see in other places. And once again, that, maybe this isn't the best type of economic engagement. If you think of this zone as like rehearsing the future, it's also rehearsing the kind of relationship you want to have with someone in the future. And it didn't feel, I think, to many that this is the best or most equal relationship. It's not the most optimistic imagining of the future. There's a little bit of humor in this too. When I visited the zone, they had like a Family Mart or ABC, one of the like South Korean kind of 7-Eleven type convenience stores, and in it there was the South Korean worker and the North Korean worker, both kind of working in the 7-Eleven, if you will. And when I was there, I couldn't help but thinking that this isn't the most, although of course it's a peaceful imagining of the future, but a future of kind of lowly paid, kind of McJobs. Well, I guess it's a future. It may be a better future than the current situation, but it also points to a kind of lack of imagination, perhaps, if you will. But yeah, certainly this kind of gendered labor that is common with light manufacturing kind of zones raises the concern of a lot of people. Certainly on the South Korean left, like in the trade unions, there was a kind of ambivalent attitude to this. On the one hand, people were concerned about exactly this type of exploitation, but also like, as you know, people who support peace of engagement didn't want to openly criticize the project too much because it was better than well nothing.
Yes, so there is another issue that through all the things that we were touching on there, the idea of the companies that invested in Kaesong and just how extraordinary risk that they were running. So we mentioned a lot about some of the challenges involved in this situation and how it's more than just a political, it's more than just an economic venture. It's a political venture and all the fraught issues between North and South Korea. So at one point, the No Mu-young presidency tries to expand the Kaesong Industrial Complex into Haeju, and the North Koreans push back on this. But this temptation to expand, in some ways, I suppose the question I'm trying to ask here is, what brought companies like Samsung Asan to invest so much? Because this is it seems to be an absolutely extraordinary risk. At any point, North Korea could shut the border, and you lose everything. And for some accounts, it didn't reach the sort of economic success that they were hoping for, and Samsung suffered some significant losses from this.
Or Hyundai Asan.
Yes, it's Hyundai.
Sorry.
Well, it certainly did a lot of the infrastructure, and the small companies invested in the factories. There was insurance. Of course, it's risky, but the South Korean government did insure. I'm not sure what extent that went to, but you know, they did. The risk wasn't purely on the companies themselves. The state also stepped in.
And also, if I add, you're done with Jamie, or?
Yeah, I'm done.
Yeah,
I thought you'd
go ahead.
Yeah, also, why the Hyundai Asan, the eagerly joined this project, because one of the reasons is that the kind of founding, father of this Hyundai is named Jung Ju-young. He's the former president of the Hyundai Jaebol, the group, and his hometown is actually the North Korean side. That's the reason his dream is that, definitely investing and the bringing back his wealth to the North Korean side. So he's actually becoming kind of bridging between the South Korean government and North Korean government, and suggesting the inter-Korean economic project. So not just there's a huge deal between the Hyundai Asan and the North Korea, because the North Korean government to guarantee some monopolistic the kind of the chance for the business in North Korea, but also this linked with the Jung Ju-young's dream about this bringing his wealth back to his hometown. That is also the reason for why Hyundai Asan, not Samsung, is more eager to join this the inter-Korean economic project. And that's the reason if you go to the Pyongyang, you can find there's one of the stadium named after the Jung Ju-young, so called the Jung Ju-young Stadium. So yeah.
Yeah, but so on that, let's introduce a strange dynamic in all of this that you both mentioned here, and this is on one side you have Kim Jong-il complaining about the slow progress of Kaesong, at least from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3. He complains about the development here, but at the same time he's got a lot of pushback from his own military, who are concerned about the strategic location of these sort of Kaesong. So let's talk about that. I suppose that regime and political and military hierarchical fault lines there.
Well, I think I answered that question, but well, as you know, that it's really hard and difficult to look inside, what's working inside the North Korean government. So I think, well, we introduced some of the journalists, and they ran the story about there's a tension between the North Korean cabinet and the North Korean military around this, the operation of the special economic zone, because the location of the Kaesong Industrial Complex was previously the heavily militarized, the zone. So that's the reason. Well, there's a saying that the military side definitely resists, the setting up this kind of the Kaesong Industrial, the complex. So that's the reason I remember that the Kim Jong-un is kind of explained that, well, against, the resistance from the military groups, and he pushed for this special economic zones. He explained to maybe Kim Dae-jung or Nomuyon, I think, President Nomuyon, about that idea that, well, there's some kind of the resistance about this special economic zones plan. Well, anyway, but we can sense definitely the North Korean, the politics is not just the leader decide everything, but also there's definitely the factional, the conflict, factional opposition around this, how the country should be run. And one of the key agenda, I think, is definitely about the expansion of the special economic zones or not. And well, someone explained that kind of the factional tension with the death of the Kim Jong-un's uncle, the Jang Song-taek. Well, that's also linked with this kind of factional tension inside the North Korean regime.
So that's actually a great point to bring in raison, which I think Jamie brought in earlier, and areas like Sinwiju on the Chinese side of the border. So how successful are these things in principle? So if we've been talking about Kaesong from one direction, let's talk about it from the other direction. These are Chinese economic zones inside, just across the North Korean border. So the Chinese haven't pulled out, though there have been some challenges over the years, like Seung-Ook just mentioned there with the execution of Jang Song-taek. So are the Chinese getting some out of this that the South Koreans were not, or do they just not suffer the sort of political challenges and the political dynamics that South Korea did?
You want to jump in, or?
I can just preface it by saying, of course, like there are volatile relations in those different zones as well, of different sort. But also that these policies have been in place for kind of 20 years too. So although some of them are not so vibrant, and some there's more investment than others, the important point there is that North Korea has made, and Seung-Ook makes this point too in his work, that North Korea has had its own approach to these kind of territorial policies, has been experimenting with this kind of stuff, not only through Kaesong, but in its policies for the last long while. I'll hand it over to Seung-Ook though.
Yeah, about the China question, well, there's some kind of widespread understanding among the South Korean scholars that China has the huge interest, in the rason, because the rason is guaranteeing the China the access to the East Sea. So China has no access to the East Sea, or maybe some of you know as the Sea of Japan. So that's the reason China heavily interested in the Russian area, so developing Russian, and even there's some competition between the Russia and the China about the Russian area. But the thing is here that, well, I was there around the border region between the China and North Korea around year in 2011, and I interviewed the government officials and the entrepreneurs there. But I think there's some kind of exaggeration about the China's interest in the Russian. But even though the local government and the local, the entrepreneurs definitely interested in the Russian, but definitely there's different interest from the central government. So like the scholars in Beijing or officials in Beijing view the Russian, well, rather than the economic side, more about this kind of the geopolitical thing. So how to sustain, how to maintain the North Korean regime as kind of their buffer against, the U.S. So that's the reason, well, definitely there are different, the views about the Russian, among the kind of the different scale of the power, I think. And you ask about the Sinwiju. Well, in case of the Sinwiju, well, Russian is kind of, well, anyway, it's kind of evolving because it's starting from the 1991. It's almost, the more than 30 years. So it's still going on. But in case of the Sinwiju, well, there's a project. North Korea tried to, set up the Siniju as so-called Special Administrative Area (SAR), modeled after Hong Kong, but actually it failed. At the time, actually, China opposed that, the Siniju plan, and there's many different interpretations about the Siniju project, why China opposed the Siniju project. But one idea is that at the time, I think that's the early 2000, well, China did not want, the competition between the Chinese city, like the Dandong with the Siniju, that's region China opposed to those projects. But after the 2011, China is heavily interested in the Siniju and the nearby the so-called Hwanggeunpyeong project. So that's the reason we can see the change of the China's strategy towards North Korea. And well, my argument is that, well, like the last one, Siniju and Hwanggeunpyeong, I think the Chinese central government view those the China and North Korea joint industrial project in these two areas. It's not just about the economic interest, it's more about the China's view of the North Korea as kind of the buffer, and they want stabilizing the buffer and more with this kind of some zoning, the experiment.
So let's talk about some of the temporary closures, and then we'll move towards the permanent closure now in the future of Kaesong. So let's talk about this moment, and you both mentioned it as well previously. In 2013, Kaesong is shut down, I believe, for a 5-month period, and it coincides with both Kim Jong-un coming to power just previously and Park Geun-hye in South Korea coming to power. And it closes down, I believe, over an issue about South Korean American joint military operations, which of course is one of those issues that once again is in the media now. So this closure, was it expected in any way? Did South Korea do something that would have caused this, even if it wasn't deserved? Was it predictable that this was going to happen, or do you both see this as just a political play from North Korea in some way here?
I guess I got to recharge my memory of this. The succession of events were, I mean, it probably wasn't so unpredictable to me from the South Korean side, since you had this kind of ratcheting up of all this kind of anti-communist rhetoric, appeasing the enemy, blah, 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 pro-North leftists. So the fact that South Korea was willing to, act on that and wasn't surprising. There's also the tensions with, I guess, government in North Korea wanting to also have a strong stance. But yeah, apologies, I forget the.
No, it's all right. And this wasn't the first time it happened either. It had happened previously in 2009, and at that point, the North Koreans shut the complex down and trapped hundreds of South Korean workers inside the complex. So this was a second moment here. So I might swing over to you, Seung-Ook, and see what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, I remember that maybe the first one, 2009, is more about, there's a negotiation between the wage issue in the North Korean workers, because the North Korean side argued that, well, it's too cheap, this wage level of the South Korean workers. That's the reason, well, there's some kind of negotiation between the South Korean side and North Korean side. Well, but that kind of failure led to those temporary close down. So problem is that since that closed down in the 2009 and also the 2013, there's an emerging view towards this Kaesong Industrial Complex in the South Korea, and especially some South Korean conservative, the people view the Kaesong Industrial Complex as the so-called hostage space. So it's become like the hostage to us. So it can turn into the threat to the South Korean security. That's the reason we need to, definitely close down the Kaesong Industrial Complex. Like one of the famous, the conservative journalist called the Jed, he was the former, I think, the editor of the Joseon-ilbo, one of the largest, the conservative newspaper. And he argued that, well, we need to shut down the Kaesong Industrial Complex, not only funding the North Korean missiles, but also it serves as a kind of hostage to us. So it is definitely a security concern. So that's the reason, this closure of this kind of some, the volatile situation around this, the temporary close down of the Kaesong Industrial Complex definitely, the triggering a new perception in South Korea about the problems of the Kaesong Industrial Complex and growing suspicion and doubt about the North Korea inter-Korean economic project among the South Korean public, I think.
Well, that should take us up to 2016. And 2016 is when Kaesong closes down, and it has been closed down ever since. Now, just before this happened, there was a scandal of sorts, a discovery that, in fact, that South Korea had there was an independent investigation, and it came out that South Korea had, in some ways, simply bribed North Korea to attend the discussions over Kaesong. There was I believe it was a $500 million down payment, and this was towards the construction of Kaesong. But I think $100 million of that was going to be simply a bribe towards to the North Koreans just to attend the discussions itself. And then in 2016, it actually shuts down permanently. And the discussion, I suppose I'll let you guys come in here and explain this. You both have had a long look at Park Geun-hye. This is Park Geun-hye that she shuts this down. And her claim at the time is that the money from Kaesong is being filtered through from the wages all the way up to the regime, and particularly towards their military and their missile technology. So, I'll get you both to come in here and take us to 2016 and this closure, and how justified Park Geun-hye was in this. Do you think?
Well, I think that also unpredictable, because Park Geun-hye argued that because of the missile test and nuclear test of the North Korea, there's no reason we can continue this project. And as you explained, they justify this decision because this Kaesong Industrial Complex, the funding the North Korean regime and the missile and nuclear power development. The problem is that, even after the Minister of the Unification announced this decision, there's a kind of doubt. Is there any evidence to support, this, the money from the Kaesong, going to the military side or the regime maintenance? There's no firm evidence about it. So that's the reason I think a few days ago, there's a congressional hearing about the Minister of the Unification under the Moon Jae-in government. And there's a question about, do you think, the shutdown of the Kaesong Industrial Complex, the reason is the funding the missile is the valid or not? And this, the candidate of the new Minister of the Unification rejected. I don't believe that. So, and there's no ground for that. So there's a huge controversy about this, the decision making about the shutdown of the Kaesong Industrial Complex. And more problem is that, there's so sudden, decision. So there's no, this kind of decision is not fully informed to the factory owners in the Kaesong Industrial Complex. So there's some huge chaos among this, the people in the people in South Korea who working and who manage the Kaesong Industrial Complex. So
I remember people just driving with their goods to get across the border. I don't know. What do you mean about the bribe? Do you mean like some of the stuff about the initial sunshine policy in the 90s?
Yes. So I've done a bit of reading here, and it seemed, from my memory and a bit of reading here, it's some of the original money put forward. At least it was claimed. It's hard to know because, as you both know, South Korean politics always seems to have deep inquiries into the other side when the new side of politics comes to power. But it seems as though at least a lot of the money that was originally put towards Kaesong was unaccounted for, and the fear was that this went a direct bribe towards the Kims just to attend the complex itself. But even if that's not the case, I'm interested in your take here on I suppose Park Geun-hye's role in this and how realistic it is.
I mean, to sort of maybe to provide a slightly more abstract answer that maybe connects it to other cases around the world. I think, what's interesting about Kaesong is it's a very physical manifestation of the kind of shared sovereignty, shared territory. There's a sort of shared nature of those things in the modern world, but a very physical manifestation, and one that is on a fault line, if you will. But, sovereignty and territoriality are like that, These days, with this resurgence of kind of right-wing populism, we sort of see this kind of very idealized understanding of sovereignty, of taking back control, of having kind of absolute control of what happens in your borders, and kind of doing things unilaterally. We see this in Trump. We see this with UKIP and Brexit. But in some ways, it's a very idealized understanding of sovereignty. There's always some kind of, either it be in this very exceptional case like Kaesong, or just in the European Union and other places, there's always some kind of shared sovereignty through trade agreements, through treaties, through other forms of relations. And so I guess maybe part of the reason why it was shut down was the power of that kind of old script, the sense of like demonstrating South Korea as a kind of coherent, integral nation. But I think that's limited the possibilities of engagement. And you see this now with Brexit and the kind of almost impossibility of dealing of the process because of the Northern Ireland issue. That the United Kingdom only works because of this shared sovereignty between the European Union and Great Britain. It's a bit of an abstract thing, but I think it maybe points to some sort of issues of the day in which there is this kind of rise of this kind of absolute notion of sovereignty that's come back, but that in some ways belies the reality of sovereignty in the modern world, where things are actually a lot more fluid and distributed than the image lets on.
And feed it. Oh, sorry, go, please.
Yeah, sorry, there's a bit of a political geographic take on everything, but.
So I suppose my question here at the moment is, and for people listening, this is one of those things that may sound simple when it's asked, but it's certainly going through people's minds here listening. So Kaesong is being at least abandoned from the South Korean side, but it's in North Korean territory right now. Now, we don't have access to it, of course. We can't tell exactly what is going on there, but we can have access a little bit of information occasionally. So I might get you to think, what do you think is happening at Kaesong today? Do we have any real information on what is happening there? And I suppose my real question is, if this was a complex run with South Korean money, South Korean investment, and South Korean managers, and with North Korean labor, are North Korea able to run this in any way by themselves, or was the pullback of South Korea a effective shutdown of the entire plant?
Where, to my knowledge, I think there's a rumor that North Korea government tried to use those, the facilities for their own production, or the rumors that North Korean government, inviting the capital to develop this, the Kaesong Industrial Complex. But I think nothing turned out to be true. Actually, they are both, the wrong, and actually just, the stay as it is. So, I think there's some kind of, the checkup by the South Korean, the people about the status of the situation of the Kaesong Industrial Complex, and not much change actually. But one of the changes that there's the map from the North Korean government to shows the special economic zones or development zones in North Korea. So originally there's a 28, the zones like the Kaesong Industrial Complex and Gyeonggang Mountain, but recently they published a new map and to remove the Kaesong Industrial Complex from the map. And it shows that they do not consider the Kaesong Industrial Complex in now operation. So that's the reason they removed the Kaesong Industrial Complex from the map.
But symbolically, isn't there a joint liaison office there now?
There was one opened in 2018, yes.
That's right.
Yes. So I suppose that leads into the next question here of if the lines of for all Kaesong it was also a valuable source of communication between North and South Korea. But in many ways, in the last year and a half, 2 years, there's been an awful lot of communication after 2017 with all the missiles and nuclear launches. The last year and a half has been quite open, a lot of back and forth, not perfect, but there's been an awful lot of communication. And Moon Jae-in has been trying to push ahead quite rapidly with this idea of economic cooperation, even ahead of the nuclear talks. So do you either, I suppose I might get you both to come in on this, how reasonable do you think it is to reopen Kaesong? Do you think it's worthwhile in this sense? Do you think Moon Jae-in is onto something here, or is this a failed project, or is it just something that's too soon in the process?
Seung-Ook, do you want to take that?
Okay, okay, let me do that. Well, actually, you may know that there's a summit meeting between the Moon Jae and Trump in the I think April 12, I think, and one of the agenda is about the reopening of these two two special economic zones like the Kaesong Industrial Complex and the Mountain Kumgang Resort. And I think there's a question from the journalist reporter about this issue, and the Trump answered that it's not the right time. When it becomes the right time, we're gonna discuss that, something like that. But definitely the South Korean side, South Korean government considered the use of the reopening the Kaesong Industrial Complex and the Kumgang Mountain Complex as one of the definitely the inducement of the North Korea towards the denuclearization. Well, that's kind of the small deal is called the step-by-step approach. But after the Hanoi summit, the U.S. government or Trump administration still stressed the big deal approach. So that's the reason where they reject this kind of opening of the Kaesong Industrial Complex is definitely hurting the sanction regime. So that's the reason it is really difficult. Even though the South Korean government pushing for the idea that reopening this Kaesong Industrial Complex, and but thing is here, under the current situation, the Trump administration opposed those ideas, and even there's some, I think the newspaper, the report from I remember the New York Times that among the foreign policy circles in Washington, there's a growing doubt, suspicion about the Moon Jae-in government because through the opening of this Kaesong Industrial Complex, the Moon government tries to definitely benefit the Kim Jong-un, something like that. They view the Moon Jae-in government as the pro-North Korean, the government. But the problem is here, actually, I think, we cannot just, argue that North Korea just, you first, abandon the nuclear, then we can, definitely lessen the sanctions. And that's kind of, the Libya model, that. So, and even the Trump, at once the John Bolton, the argue that we need to follow the Libya model, and Trump later rejected idea. But after Hanoi summit, I think the Trump's policy is going back to the Libya model, and I don't think North Korea accept that deal. So that's the reason. Someone still hope that this Kaesong Industrial Complex serve as some kind of the one of the policy options to both the U.S. and North Korea. But if each side stick to their own, the position, I think it's very hard to find, this Kaesong Industrial Complex serve as some efficient, the policy option to bring about, the new momentum for the inter-Korean relationship and the peace and stability in the Korean Peninsula.
So that was quite a comprehensive answer, but I might also turn it to you, Jamie. So what future do you see for Kaesong in general, and is it a wise project to still be pushing for, at least from the South Korean side?
I mean, I think there's kind of different angles in on this, but I think, the long-term political project of overcoming the Cold War, of overcoming the division system, in terms of that kind of project, which I think is the most important political project out of all of these things, these zones have played a role. They are experiments. They are ways to kind of rehearse engagement, and in some ways are worth supporting to that extent. So I think there's a role for some lessons learned from some relations accumulated, new ways of doing things, etc., from Kaesong and some of the other zones. So I try to look at it maybe more from that perspective. That this project of overcoming the division system is very important. It's a democratic goal, but unfortunately, it's so geopolitically inflected because of the nature of the regime in Washington, North Korea's own kind of geopolitical perceptions, which are still kind of hard to read. There's been a lot of hope and optimism over the last year, and a kind of ratcheting down of tensions along the DMZ, which are good, but then also, that's also kind of hamstrung by this kind of hardline approach. So I don't know. In the interest of the feeling that the Korean people, the South Koreans, etc., have the biggest things at stake here, and kind of overcoming that system, I think it's worth to support these things. And the extra layers of geopolitics certainly kind of hinder that project, but we can't really I guess, get out of that situation, can we? Because that brings in the whole topic of the geopolitical order and its influence on the Korean Peninsula.
Well, you did mention there the volatility in Washington. So, as a final question on this, and you've both done some research on this too, so I have to bring it in here. Both of your thoughts on Donald Trump and the import that this would have for Kaesong. So, as you both mentioned in your research, he brings a lot of challenges, a lot of risks, but he is also quite open. He's also open to summit talks. He talks a lot about about developing North Korea if it'll only open up. So, might get your thoughts on this. Is Donald Trump a helpful person in this regard for Kaesong and the future of inter-Korean economic cooperation?
I thought for the last little while, the turbulence did provide quite an opportunity, right? As you say, Trump's desire for spectacle and recognition, and even kind of development, created an opportunity for these forms of engagement. And Seung-Ook will know more about this now, but I get the feeling in the last little while that the more hawkish foreign policy elite have kind of secured more influence on the direction of things. So perhaps that moment is receding now.
Well, I think you may sense there's a definitely huge shift in the Trump's, the vision of the North Korea. So in 2017 or 2016, he described the North Korea or Kim Jong-un regime as like the hell-like place or something like that. So he's kind of demonized definitely the North Korea. But well, after the 2018, the Singapore summit and those things, there's a consistent, the narratives, Trump described the North Korea. He's kind of stressing, the economic potential of the North Korea. So he's stressing about the location, the great location of the North Korea and blah, blah, blah. So he continuously, the highlight the economic potential of the North Korea. Even, the 2 weeks, before there's a summit between the Trump and Moon Jae-in in this, the press interview, he's still stressing, there's some good relationship, not just the good relationship with the Kim Jong-un, but also the economic potential of the North Korea. So, well, even though I know that there's definitely the huge controversy around the Trump's domestic policy in the U.S., but well, in case of the Korean Peninsula, definitely he's changing the dynamics, geopolitical dynamics in the Korean Peninsula. He's kind of but the policy by the Obama kind of strategic patience. There's no the policy about this strategy about the North Korea from the U.S. side. So it actually led to the progress of the North Korea's nuclearization. But the Trump's policy definitely makes some definitely shift. And we don't know yet it is the good way or bad way, but definitely I think, there's some new momentum in the Korean Peninsula, at least by the Trumps. But, it's early to tell, but we'll see how his approach. And as Jamie mentioned, recently there's a hawkish approach from the Trump government, definitely, raising the chances, the peace and stability in the Korean Peninsula returning back to, more tension and position, I think.
We'll have to wait and see, I guess, huh? So that is a great place to end this on. I am going to link below this podcast for everyone links to Jamie and Seung-Ook's research on this. Please go and read it. It's a lot more detailed than what we managed to get through today, so it'll fill in a lot of the gaps for you as well. So on that, Jamie Doucette and Seung-Ook Lee, thanks for coming on the Korean Podcast.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you so much.